Good afternoon and welcome to Free West Media, the YouTube channel. If you haven't done so before, please subscribe to the channel because going forward, we're going to have a lot of exciting interviews and discussions. And today is just such an occasion because on the other side of the connection, I've got Saxon African. She's a young lady who's very active on the X platform. And she describes herself as a libertarian and an activist, although she's not affiliated to any political party or any organization. So good afternoon, Saxon African.
Thank you for having me, Dan. I appreciate that. It's just great to have a platform where we can speak about these issues.
Excellent. First of all, what does Saxon African mean?
Saxon African is a term that I chose to represent myself as I am a born-free South African. I was born in 1994, shortly after the fall of apartheid. Most of my family has got Saxon heritage, even on my father's side, which is Afrikaans. Even going further back, they've had nearly 350 years of heritage in this area, not just in the Cape. So a lot of people like to claim that we are not South African because we are of a lighter skin tone. We are white. We're not a black African, so therefore we can't be African. It's an attack on our heritage. It's an attack on who we are as a people, with our own culture and our own history. They like to call us settlers a lot. So essentially, by calling yourself African as a white person, that in itself is taking a stand against racist bullying that happens by the majority onto a minority that we see on a daily basis.
Yes, I've seen some really vicious comments on X, by some black South Africans recently, especially after this AfriForum visit to the US, as well as Alan Root's interview with Tucker Carlson. A lot of them just say, you must go back to Europe. But I don't know about you, but I don't have a European passport.
How can you go back to a country that you haven't been in for 350 years? I personally haven't. So how could you tell me to go back to a country I'm not born in? I was not raised in. I don't know the culture. My people are here.
Exactly. Okay, but we also wanted to talk a little bit about, I think we might get back to these issues of our identity and the South African identity as well, and whatever that might mean. But we were also going to speak about a subject that's quite close to your heart, and that is land grabs. Because there is land grabbing going on in South Africa, not so?
All around us. The government denies it vehemently. They say that it hasn't been legislated, at least until now, where we see the Expropriation Act being signed, the bill, by Cyril Ramaphosa. And, I think land grabs it's not new to South Africa. We've had hundreds of them, if not thousands, since even before 1994. However, the difference was when it happened in 1994, there was a police presence to help people who had their land stolen. People were removed that tried to illegally settle on privately owned land. So what's happening now is basically they will come in and they will settle in the thousands. It's an organized settlement. And you might show up to try and protect your land, but what's going to happen is the police will eventually show up, but they'll show up to remove you. They won't show up to remove the settlers, who they unfortunately are essentially allowing for it to happen on an institutional level. They might deny it that it hasn't happened yet on a formal level, but it is happening on a daily basis, on an institutional level.
Yeah, and I think some of these more radical political parties, even left of the ANC, they are encouraging this kind of stuff. You must have heard of this Bredell case that took place in the early 2000s, near Tembisa, where the PAC, Pan-Africanist Congress, they actually sold plots of land to squatters for something like 5 rand or 25 rand. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was a really very low amount. I mean, sort of not even the price of a cup of coffee, and you could buy a plot of land there. And the land was it was a mixture of private property and government and municipal property. But it affected all the properties around, because suddenly you had this influx of people without any sanitation, without water, electricity, nothing of the kind. And it just caused a complete mess. And there were some court cases afterwards. And I think eventually the court case was settled in favor of the people who wanted to see an eviction. But as far as I remember, it was extremely difficult, because by that time there had already been so many people settling there that the cost of doing the eviction by, say, a private security company would be so big that nobody could afford it, and the police was not prepared to do it. So that's the kind of situation we find ourselves in often in South Africa, and there have been cases like that in Cape Town too. Not so?
Yeah, absolutely. I understand that there was an incident in Cape Town recently where I believe it was a castle, which is a monument, a heritage site, that was taken over by squatters. And I believe the city has now evicted them, but it has taken them decades, if a decade at least. And I can't imagine how that's affected the residents around the area. I mean, you think about adding another 5,000 residents onto your water and sanitation suddenly, demanding services. People that are often new into the area as well. These are not people that are locals. These are people that have come from afar, Limpopo, Eastern Cape. They are not local to the area.
And some of them are even foreigners from other
Completely
African
illegal.
countries.
Just walked across our super porous borders, So a lot of people, I think, like to say that most of those squatter camps are illegal. I don't buy that for 1 second. I think that there is a large amount of illegal settlers for sure. But I think an even larger amount of people coming in from Limpopo and Eastern Cape that are looking for a place either for work or for safety.
Well, the one-time leader of the political opposition in South Africa, Helen Zille, she once referred to the people from the Eastern Cape as refugees in the Western Cape. And she was criticized quite a lot for that. But that's the irony, that you've got a province like the Eastern Cape, which is entirely ANC run, but the people vote for the ANC, but they flee from their own government
They
towards the
do.
Western Cape.
They do, and it happens a lot. We see people in the Eastern Cape, they have land. They come from land, they come from small villages where there's sustenance farming to make ends meet, essentially. But there's no work. So as a young person that decides that maybe you don't want to be a sheep herder your whole life, what do? You're going to go to the city. Where's the city? The Western Cape, Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg, Pretoria. So we're starting to see a lot more land grabs around residential areas, which is becoming a big problem for our infrastructure, for our safety. We're putting people who have no backup into these situations. Well, they're putting themselves in these situations where they have no backup. If they can't find the job that they are hoping to find, then what? Well, how are you going to put food on the table? 350 Rand grant isn't going to do that.
Yes. Can you remember how in 1994, when the ANC took over, have you ever seen the statistics about how many people there were in this Gauteng province at the time?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, as far as I recall, there were only 5 million people in Gauteng at the time. and there are now 15 million people. So the population has trebled in 30 years. Now imagine it trebling again to 45 million, whatever, in the next 30 years. It's clearly it's not sustainable. This
No, not at all. And we want to say, oh, our infrastructure is falling apart, but our infrastructure was designed for 5 million people, but it's catering to 15, and often in spaces that were never planned to have people, wetlands, for example. How are we laying pipes and new infrastructure for electricity for houses that, I have never, in areas that are not suitable for living, but we have no control over where people move and where they live.
Yes, and I saw the other day that some statistic that only 1 in 30 people in South Africa pays tax. Now that's the income tax and national income tax, but when it comes to local taxes, I think it must be even less.
Lower.
It's probably even lower. So there's a very small number of people in formal housing in suburbs or in apartment buildings and so on, and they are paying local taxes, and the rest just don't pay a cent, but they expect all these services for free.
And at the click of a button, essentially, you cannot move into a completely blank space of land and expect government to supply you with electricity and water, sanitation. But we're complaining about it, or at least they are. We're very quick to jump down people's throats and claim inequality, when the reality is that you cannot compare someone who's been situated in a space for 30 years with someone who moved there last week.
Exactly, because it takes some so-called town planning to
Absolutely.
provide these services, but then we also know that the town planning in a city like Johannesburg is also, almost collapsed, because the little town planning that is left is being done by private companies and private developers. They are taking over the functions of the municipality. A while back, maybe a year or two ago, I spoke to one of those big private developers, and according to him, they do everything themselves, and they just take the documents to the municipality and have it signed off by some official there. But the municipality itself does absolutely nothing, and the private developers do everything. That's where new developments are concerned. But when it comes to these sort of random, informal kind of squatting of people, the municipality isn't involved, and the private developers aren't involved either. So it's just complete chaos.
Absolutely. And we can criticize the municipality all we want, but at the same time, their hands are bound by the laws that have been implemented by our government. How could you possibly town plan when you buy a property, and if you don't basically develop it immediately, it will get land grabbed?
True.
There is no way to like formally plan, essentially, when there is so much chaos.
Yes, and when you also think about, I don't know whether you've ever been involved in building your own house or having it built or whatever, but there are all kinds of regulations regarding, we've got fairly strict building regulations
Extremely strict building
in
regulations.
South Africa. I mean, a lot of the housing that they put up in the US won't be allowed in South Africa because it's just of too low quality.
Not to scratch,
They
yeah.
build cardboard houses over there, it seems to me. Having driven around there, you see these places and they sort of cover them in wood and plastic and stuff like that. I mean, that would never be allowed in South Africa. We live in brick houses. But we've got all these regulations applying to us, but when somebody puts up some shack somewhere, then suddenly they don't apply anymore.
It's the land of the lawless. As provided you are poor, there is no land, there is no law for you to worry about. You can live wherever you please. You can demand whatever you want. If you commit a crime, you may get out on bail pretty much immediately if they give you bail at all.
You're talking about also, what you calling the lawlessness and of these land grabs and squatting and so on. I don't know if you know where the Porsche dealership here in Johannesburg is in Witkoppen Avenue, but there's an informal squatter camp right next to it. So you've got this place where all the rich people go to buy cars, including very many government officials and municipal officials. They all drive Porsches. That's the paradox of South Africa. You've got poverty coexisting with wealth, and often ill-acquired wealth, through the corruption of the system, of this government. And right across the road from that, there's another squatter camp that sprung up over the last year or so. And it's just totally amazing. And it's allowed, it's contrary to all the municipal bylaws and regulations, and nobody does a thing.
I think we have to admit, though, a lot of people like to say this, that South Africa is a testing pot for the rest of the world. And what we're witnessing here is two-tier policing. So if you are of middle class or up, you are policed. There will be laws, there will be repercussions for doing something against the law. But if we apply it to everyone, that doesn't happen here. In South Africa, if you are considered poor or even just connected, there's very little that gets done if you just do your own thing. If you decide to develop a piece of land that's not up to scratch, that's a wetland, or maybe even just build subpar housing. I mean, we look at our RDP houses that we've built millions of RDP housing structures here in South Africa, and people complaining that they are not lasting. I mean, those houses are most of them are less than 20 years old. That shouldn't be happening. And that's because of the building companies just not using following the correct guidelines. And why are those building companies that are doing work for the government and finance for the government not being taken to task? Well, I think we can come to a conclusion there.
Exactly. And, it's become almost a cliche to compare the conditions pre-1994 with conditions now. And, there are so many misconceptions as well about what the situation was like in the past. But I think I mentioned to you that I wrote an article in the Report Sunday newspaper last year, but I didn't go into the details much. But part of it entailed my visiting the township of Kwatema, the Black Township, or Black Ghetto, as they say in US English. And there the newspaper's photographer took a lot of pictures of me and so on. But it was also fascinating to visit that area. And the whole subject of my article, I stumbled upon some information about some young left-wing architects who were involved in the 1950s in constructing housing for black people. And they were infusing the housing with all sorts of humanitarian and left-wing principles, egalitarian, humanitarian, and so on. And they built, there's a community hall there that's a beautiful structure, and it's still standing. I mean, it hasn't been maintained for decades, but it still looks extremely good. And a lot of the houses there are also extremely well built. So we've come from there, from what they say the horrible past was, to this situation where it's anything goes and where things fall apart literally, like these RDP houses you're referring to.
If you own a company and you are of African descent, you are not subject or scrutinized nearly as much as someone who might be of a different race or minority race, whether you're Indian or white or colored.
Are you saying that if you own a company and you're black, then you don't have to file all your returns and reports?
Well, I think it would just go unnoticed.
Yes.
I think that's the reality of it. If a white or Indian or minority-owned company were to do that, SARS would be on you very quickly.
Sure.
I'm not saying that it doesn't eventually get taken to task, but you can fly under the radar much longer than you think if you are a person of another color. And we see this with BEE tenders all the time. You know, they are directly dealing with government. You would expect the standards to be absolutely held high, but that's typically where we see the most problems in construction, in business practices, illegal hiring. You know, they're very quick to blame white farmers for hiring illegal immigrants, but they don't speak about these cadre connected level one, which means pretty much all black ownership, or 51% black ownership female companies that dominate the JSE, which is basically our big trading platforms and our country and how we can invest in them. They completely dominate. It's thousands of jobs. And the vast majority of them are held by illegal immigrants or immigrants that are on ZEP permits.
Have you heard of the construction mafia?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And apparently there are these gangs or organized criminals who actually blackmail construction companies into giving them contracts or employing their workers and so on. And apparently you can't. I think one of the opposition leaders from the DA said something to this effect just the other day, that you can't get any major building project done in South Africa without working with the construction mafia and paying protection money to them.
Exactly. And we are aware of this problem, but why are we not policing it? Why are our cops not making an effort, the Hawks not making an effort to sting these individuals involved with this?
Yeah, well, the head of the Hawks is now involved in. He made a statement that they were going to investigate the 4 people from AfriForum who went to the US to speak to some politicians there, to do some lobbying work there. And they are going to be investigated for high treason. So, you when you speak to the wrong people, you commit high treason in another country. But in our own country, all of this organized crime is going on and nothing happens. So, what you're saying there about 2-tier policing in South Africa is definitely...
It's been around for a long time, but it's definitely spreading to the West. We see it, especially stories coming out of the UK, for example. I believe that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, has just said that they aim to reduce sentences for Muslim individuals that have been arrested. But he didn't mention it for any other criminals with different and diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, as far as I understand it, if you commit a crime now, I think they've just passed a law like that in the UK, that if you commit a crime in the UK, but you belong to a minority faith or a minority ethnic group, i.e. Muslim or Indian or whatever, Pakistani, in the UK, then they have sentencing guidelines that require a lower sentence for such a person than for a native Briton.
Exactly. And one of the most disturbing things that we are seeing around the world is left-wing governments are declaring the right as terrorist groups, regardless of whether who's actually driving cars into people at Christmas markets. And it is interesting to see that there's very few things that are happening and being done to try and prevent these terrible acts of violence against native populations. Native populations that are typically quite peaceful are being ostracized. Minority populations that are typically quite peaceful are actually ostracized, while the ones that are quite violent are championed.
Exactly.
It doesn't make sense.
You might not... I mean, I follow events in France a little bit because I lived there at one point, and I also understand French and speak French. And in fact, the other day I was typing in the word Nahel, and I saw one of my own ex postings from a year ago that jumped out at me, and I'd actually commented on that. But there was a person, a man of mixed French Algerian nationality, and he went on what they call in France a rodeo, i.e., he went on some sort of wild driving away from the police, a getaway kind of a drive in his car, and that was extremely dangerous, and the police told him to stop, and he didn't want to stop, and then one of the policemen fired a shot and killed him. So now, and there were some riots in France as a result of that.
Yes, I remember those riots. It very
But
nearly
now
spread to
what's
the UK
happened
as well.
recently is that apparently Macron, the president of France, has told the public prosecutor that they must charge the policeman with murder, and the guy he was trying to arrest, he's getting off scot-free, but the policeman is now being charged with murder because, first of all, I think Macron is scared of having more riots in his country, and secondly, apparently the Algerian government put pressure on him to do that. So, can you believe it?
I'm not sure if you're familiar with a video that happened. It's absolutely tragic. I'm not sure if it was in France, but there was a terror attack happening with a knife. I think it was a Muslim man from, I'm not sure where, Afghanistan, I think, or Syria, stabbing onlookers at a public square, and two police officers came to try and stop the commotion. And instead of arresting the person that's stabbing people, they started arresting people that had been stabbed. And in the process of that, the criminal, the terrorist that was doing this, got on top of one of the police officers while he was arresting this man that was bleeding out, and stabbed him in the neck and actually killed him. So,
I think the incident you're referring to happened in Germany.
Germany, yes.
Recently, yes. Yeah, I mean, the German government is also, of course, completely insane when it comes to these sorts of issues. It's sort of a worldwide phenomenon, and we in South Africa, we've been subject to it now for the past 30 years under this regime. But getting back to the cities and the squatters and the land grabs and so on, what's happening here, I think, is also spreading to the rest of the world, because I remember, I was in Paris a few months, or last month or so, but I think a year before, on my previous visit, I was taking the train to the airport, and then I saw these shanties right next to the railway in France. I'd never seen that in my life before. In a place like France, where even the smallest village is clean and orderly and pristine, and people maintain these buildings from the Middle Ages, and there are laws about, having to preserve and conserve buildings and so on. And here they are with
Heritage sites,
shacks,
that are getting used
next
as illegal occupation.
To the railway. You may have heard of there's a book by a French author called Jean Raspail. It became a kind of a bestseller in France, and then it was translated into English in the early 70s, and it was called in English The Camp of the Saints. Have you ever heard of a book like that?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Well, yeah, it also, I think it sold 2.5 million copies in the US as well. But it's a story about the sort of the peaceful occupation of France. And you've got an influx. There was these boats with third world people from India and other places, and eventually, and then it was still the old South Africa, and they wanted to land in South Africa, but apparently our old government, fictionally in the book, told them, get lost. We don't want you here. And eventually they went, and they ran aground or landed in the south of France on the Côte d'Azur, on the French Riviera, and from there they sort of invaded the whole country. And it was sort of an allegory for what was going to happen to the West. And I think it was a prophetic book, and he's such an interesting guy, this Jean Raspail. He died a few years ago as well, but it's a beautifully written book, and it was so prophetic what he foresaw, that you can resist an armed invasion of your country, but it's very difficult to resist this kind of peaceful, passive kind of just this encroachment
using
onto
democracy
your land,
against
onto
you.
your country. And that's precisely what we are living through, isn't it?
Yes, 100%. They are using democracy against the West. We see it all the time. Essentially, they come in, they flood in, and then they have like 5 kids. You know, even if they are 10% of the population today, then they will be 50% of the population within a generation.
Well, yeah, I think in Europe there are all sorts of stories like that, and of course, in most Western European countries, over here they've got these child grants of 350 or 400 rand a month, which is nothing. But in Europe, I think you can get 2,000 or 3,000 rand per month per child. So, there are all these cases where you've got a guy from West Africa, and now, especially in France, I think it's forbidden to practice polygamy. But I think in practice it still exists. But you've got this guy who's got maybe 8 or 10 kids and 1 or 2 wives, maybe one official one, and then they've got social housing as well. So he's actually not paying for housing.
Anything.
And
not paying
he
rent, not paying for
earns
food.
maybe 30,000 rand per month for doing nothing.
Free healthcare.
Free healthcare, exactly. And he's gonna he's going
creating
to
a
get a
huge
pension
vacuum.
as well. Where when he's above 62 or 65, he's going to get a pension as well. So how long can this system endure?
Cope. Yeah.
It's
and unfortunately, they like to think that the children of many of these immigrants are going to just become part of the native population, but they don't, because they've let in so many people that they don't socialize with the native population. You have entire areas that get taken over by people from Algeria, and then another area that's taken over from Syria. It becomes a problem. You never truly assimilate. Even generations in, you truly do not assimilate. And that affects voting patterns. It affects everything from city planning to family planning to school culture taught in school.
Well, I know in France, there's a left-wing. I mean, the left, as in the US, where all the illegal immigrants vote for the Democrats. There's a left-wing party in France called LFI, La France Insoumise, or the Insurrectionist France, or whatever, or the Uncowed or Unbowed France, it's called. But it's sort of an old communist sort of a party, and there's one radical politician, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and he said once on TV that the solution for France is creolization. In other words, the French population must intermingle with the newcomers and with the foreign migrants and so on, and they must become another people, a Creole people. Is that not the most insane idea you've ever heard?
I mean, it would be better than having them essentially doing what they're doing right now, where they are completely separate. They're still Syrians. They're still completely loyal to their home country, just within France. And all we could hope for was that maybe the French culture rubs off on them over, living together. But unfortunately, that's just not possible. The uncontrolled migration has made that completely impossible, because you have thousands of people coming in on a daily basis. Where do you house them?
Yes, exactly.
How do you split them up so that they do assimilate?
And then you've got, of course, this kind of criminal element as well, the gang element,
Absolutely,
and a
that
lot of the
follows in.
teachers in those areas, they're actually scared of the pupils at the
Oh,
schools.
yeah. Especially female teachers, because keep in mind
Mm.
those kids have grown up in societies where women are not seen as equal or valued as in positions of power.
Now, if you think about what it looks like there out in the Western world, I mean, what are our weak points of view? So what? And there's
We're
a sort
too
of
tolerant.
cliche in business as SWOT analysis. What is that?
And I say
Strengths,
that as a
weaknesses,
libertarian.
and what? Yeah, and you know, what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses here compared to say the rest of the world? Because you know, if you go to America and you tell them, I think that's also maybe why Trump reckons we should just all become refugees in America. Um, they tell you, you know, but why don't you just immigrate to the US? You know, why bother with South Africa? But then I think in some ways we are more resilient than a lot of other Western people out there because we
Absolutely.
fend for ourselves.
We've been ostracized.
Yes, and we fought this sort of world opinion for a long time, and yes, we've been ostracized. I think it goes even beyond ostracization. When I lived in France, there, you know, that was sort of at the height of the anti-apartheid campaign and so on. I mean, we were more or less stigmatized. I mean, we were
Absolutely.
really, but suddenly that has changed. You know, it dawned on me a few years ago. I went through an airport in Germany, and the guy looked at my passport and he said, "Oh, you see, you're from South Africa. So you're from that place where Elon Musk comes from." So I think you know, Elon
Okay.
Musk is now the
Mm.
emblematic sort of South African. It's no longer Eugene de Blanche on his horse with a kind of a funny
The
flag or something.
rifle and
Yeah,
whatnot.
exactly. So there's, I think there's been a reappraisal of the the
Well,
Saxon African, of the Saxon
absolutely.
African, of the
Absolutely. And
Afrikaner and the
I
Boer
believe
and so
Elon
on.
Musk is also of Saxon descent. So
Yes, well, he grew up in Pretoria and so on.
from an English background. Yeah, it is interesting how it has changed, and I would probably agree with you in the fact that because white children and minority kids in general are not subject to the same expectations, we have actually been forced to work a little bit harder. We can't skate past on a 50% and expect to be accepted into university like our black counterpart, who might also come from a family of wealth. You know, there's plenty of them, but they'll still get chosen above children that come from Soweto just because they might get 2 or 3% more, but they come from wealth. But because they're black, they're considered victims of apartheid, and regardless of whether they've ever seen apartheid or even if their family was involved in the country at all in that time. And minority children are unfortunately subject to, well, not unfortunately, maybe it's a fortunate thing. We're subject to a different grading standard to move forward with our lives, to study further, to if you really want to stand out in the workplace, you really have to stand out. And you still might not get hired, you might not get promoted to move through the ranks unless you start your own business, which is again playing favor to us in a way, because if you can't become an employer, you become employee, you become an employer. And it continuously skews the stats because they say, oh, so many white people own X amount of businesses in South Africa, and this is the percentage and the ratio. But you've put white people in a situation where they can't really become employees.
And so, yes, so then they force us to become entrepreneurs and to own businesses.
Exactly. And then it
Yeah, and then they
skews the
complain
stats
about
even
that.
further.
Yeah,
So,
it's kind of, yeah, there are two things that come to mind to me here. The one is, you're probably familiar with, Nietzsche's famous maxim, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And the other thing is that, in Toynbee, who is also, an English historian, he wrote this, study of history series of books about civilizations and how they rise and fall. And one of the things about successful civilizations is that they are constantly dealing with adversity. Either it's the climate, the cold, or harsh winters, wars, or being attacked by other people. So that adversity actually gives a lot of discipline to your people, and eventually you rise up and you build this magnificent civilization. You become
or
an empire or whatever. And I think you could say that of us at the moment. We've got all this adversity and all these rules and laws against us.
And there's no safety blanket.
And because you have to push against that, you become stronger and more. We study longer and we put a lot more into our education. I saw an article a few months ago where some girl, her mother was a doctor, and she wanted to become a medical doctor, and she was excluded on racial grounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then she studied BSc with the intent of getting into medical school, and then they still excluded her, even after she had another degree and so on. And then she went to Riga in Latvia, and she got accepted to medical school there, and she's now studying in Riga, Latvia. And, in other countries, people don't have to try that hard just to get an education.
Yeah, you don't have to leave your country to go get an education just because of the color of your skin.
Yeah.
And I mean, now we've lost probably a very bright mind and a young person, in our workforce.
Although
to Latvia. She might return, but you'll probably have to retake exams and whatnot. But I mean, why would you come back to a country that's racially excluded you your whole life, regardless of whether you were involved with apartheid? She was probably born well after apartheid ended, and she's still been racially excluded for something that she likely had, or in her family likely had nothing to do with.
Yes, exactly. But I think that's a whole separate discussion. What's happening to young people and their brain drain and so on.
Look at Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And apparently, there are now so many South African engineers and especially Afrikaner engineers working in the Netherlands and Belgium and so on, that they now have braais in the woods there in Europe. Yes. They all speak Afrikaans and so on. So there's a whole diaspora community there. So
that's beginning to pick up. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think, maybe on that note, thank you for the discussion, and to the viewers, if you've watched up to this point, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's do another. Let's have another discussion quite soon. And thank you very much for today's input. And
sounds great. I look forward to being back.
Saxon African, she's on X, and we'll put the link in the description below.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Until next time.
Ciao.
Bye.